other people just don't train them, and the dogs are unregistered, unlicensed, and owned by criminals.
You can go online and find statistics like 91% of all fatal attacks in recent years have been from either Rottweilers or some combination of pit bull crosses. But a study by American vets says this: the incidence of pit bull type dogs' involvement in severe or fatal attacks may be associated with prevalence of at-risk dogs in neighbourhoods with lots of young children. Owners of stigmatised breeds are more likely to have involvement in these neighbourhoods, and apparent breed correlations may be due to patterns in owner behaviour. In other words, they're saying that the pit bull per se is not necessarily the problem.
I don't know enough to know.
No,
I mean, it could be the kind of person that that gets a pit bull and treats that pit bull in a certain kind of way, amplifies an already dog that's already bred for fighting, and makes, I dare say, a pit bull brought up in a caring, loving environment is less likely, though not completely unlikely, is less likely to behave in an aggressive and dangerous manner than one that's been raised in a nasty environment where it's fighting all the time and beaten and all the rest of it. I mean, that just is no different from a human being. So yeah, I can see how that would be the case from that study.
All right. This isn't a hot off the press story exactly, but seeing as you're on,
it's old. Yes,
I got an old story for you.
It's an old stale story for you, Clay.
Golfer Jordan Spieth faltering at the Masters on the final day.
Yep.
Surrendering a 5-stroke lead with 9 holes to play, and a shock victory for Danny Willett.
Yep.
Bogeys on 10 and 11, and a 7-shot nightmare on the par 3 12th. Choke is not a nice word, it's a cruel word, but it springs to mind. And you must see it among comedians. I mean, what happens, do you think, to this? It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it?
Well, I used to play a lot of golf as well, quite badly, with other comedians, as a matter of fact, and so I quite revel in the fact that a professional scores a 7. But it happens on stages, too much information, too much going on in your head, and not enough calmness. That's what it comes, not enough clarity in your thought, if it is the same kind of thing. And I would assume that he did a similar kind of thing. He had dropped from a weird place and he could have stopped at that. But when you get flustered is when there's too much input for you to deal with, and there's not enough familiarity with you to be able to process it quickly enough.
Those golfers, though, must have a lot of psychological training.
I think golfers, in a certain kind of a way, are some of the mentally toughest sports people there are.
Yeah.
Not in a, I can put myself through pain, or I can take a punch, or I can go the extra mile kind of way, but to be able to compartmentalise a mistake and then go on and it not to affect very small motor movements in your next shot, it is an absolute art, one that I don't possess, Jim. Having destroyed 2 golf bags with my clubs on golf courses, yet I would consider myself mentally tough in other ways. So I used to run distance running and what have you. But there's a certain mental toughness that golfers have, that the top golfers have.
You're saying golf is mentally tough?
Yep, to be able to...
The sport with the little ball that goes in the hole where you wear plaid pants, that one.
That one.
So apparently appearance from the girl with a bad haircut is at the
low
forefront.
Blow.
Well, if you're going to go there...
That was low.
If you're going to go there... No, it is. Having played it, you play. I'd play one bad hole, and then my next 6 holes were bad because I was that much more tense. That they can, in a certain kind of mental toughness. As I said, not a street brawling kind of toughness, not a I can put myself through pain toughness, but a certain kind of mental composure that you see when it lacks. What happened? When it suddenly goes, what happened?
Not quite jumping out of a plane.
No, different kind of toughness. There are different kinds of toughness. I mean.
What do people most successfully do, and I guess your expertise would be with comedians, to get their nerves under control? Do you reckon?
The best way to get nerves under control is maybe 300, 400, 500 gigs.
Yeah. Or even better,
I thought you were going to
1,000.
say 3, 4 pints.
No, just do the gigs. I never drink before a show. Just do the gigs. It's the only way, familiarity.
Unsocialised dogs are the problem, says the texter. Dogs kept on chains most of their life, never engaging with other dogs or people, never knowing affection or a cosy evening by the fire.
Yeah, I'd say that exacerbates it.
Lisa Scott, lovely to have your company today.
Lovely to talk to the both of you.
The hair will look fine in about a fortnight.
It'll grow back.
Oh, just a fortnight. Okay. I'll get a hat. It's getting cold
hats,
anyway.
There you go.
Andrew Clay, nice to have your
Always
company.
a pleasure, Jim.
Thanks, everybody. Back tomorrow with the panel.
Kia ora everyone, welcome to Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm John Campbell. On behalf of the Checkpoint team, thank you for joining us. Tonight on the programme, more on tax, trusts and politicians. How did the Ministry of Education not know an utterly predatory pedophile was moving from school to school over a period of years? Compass assign a person to the wards in Dunedin to monitor the response to the food they're serving patients. And water in Ashburton, if some of it is full of nitrates, how is some of it also worth bottling? All of that and more over the next 90 minutes. But first, here's Katrina Batten with RNZ News.
Kia ora, good evening. The government is calling for mandatory reporting of concerns for all school support staff, not just teachers and principals. It comes in the wake of today's sentencing of a school caretaker and bus driver, Robert Burritt, at the High Court in Christchurch for sexually assaulting a dozen schoolgirls. He was sentenced to almost 20 years in prison. The Education Minister, Hekia Parata, says caretakers and school bus drivers should be reported if their conduct or competence is in doubt.
At the moment, the system captures teachers and principals, but clearly in this particular case, this person actually had finished in the profession and had been employed in another role. So I've asked the Ministry and the Education Council to investigate extending their powers.
Hekia Parata says she feels very sad for Burritt's victims and their families, and she hopes today's sentencing brings them some comfort. The register containing details of MPs' finances states the Prime Minister has a short-term deposit with a firm specialising in foreign trusts. This comes as the government is responding to criticism New Zealand is being used by wealthy people around the world as a tax haven through the use of foreign trusts. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
On its website, the Antipodes Trust Group touts the use of New Zealand-based foreign trusts to carefully manage the intergenerational transfer of wealth and lists the benefits of New Zealand's legal structure. A spokesperson for Mr Key says the cash deposit was registered with his personal lawyer, Ken Whitney, in the pecuniary register last year, but Mr Whitney has since moved firms to Antipodes. Meanwhile, in Parliament this afternoon, the Labour Party leader Andrew Little tabled his personal tax records and challenged Mr Key to do the same. From Parliament, Chris Bramwell.
The government is taking the highly contentious decision about fluoridation of water supplies away from local authorities. It plans to introduce legislation later this year to move the decision-making process to district health boards. The Health Minister, Jonathan Coleman, says DHBs have the knowledge and support to make the decision. Currently, about half of the population drinks fluoridated water, and Dr Coleman wants that to increase. But the anti-fluoride campaigner, Mary Byrne, says the government's trying to take the whole discussion about fluoride away from the public and make it mandatory. Dr Coleman says by allowing DHBs to make the decision, people can still have their say through elected representatives. A prominent man charged with indecently touching two girls has been acquitted after a High Court jury trial in Whangarei. The man was found not guilty on all 12 counts of indecency in a unanimous decision delivered this afternoon. Lois Williams was in court.
The jury of 6 men and 5 women told the judge this morning they'd reached a stalemate after deliberating for less than 4 hours. But just after 2, they returned with the not guilty verdicts. The man's family and friends applauded the jury and embraced, while his son and elderly father wept with relief. The man shook hands and hugged family members but had no comment for reporters. Justice Venning has reserved his decision on whether to lift suppression on the man's name. This is Lois Williams.
The Māori Party says its continued support for a massive ocean sanctuary around the Kermadec Islands is not guaranteed. The Māori Fisheries Trust, Te Ohu Kaimoana, is taking legal action, and several prominent Māori leaders have come out publicly opposing the sanctuary. The Māori Party co-leader Marama Fox says Māori have been forced to choose sides. She says this is typical divide and conquer tactics.
I mean, we've supported Ohu Kaimoana's right to take this to court. Their property rights have been diminished, and in fact this is the government saying that no matter what your settlements are, if we choose to change the rules halfway down the road, we'll do that and ignore everything that we've already put into law.
Marama Fox. Legislation putting in place the sanctuary passed its first reading last month with unanimous support and is now being considered by a parliamentary select committee. Auckland councillors have voted behind closed doors to start the process of fixing their office tower. The 29-storey building is just 25 years old, but its exterior is failing and there's risk its large granite slabs of cladding will fall. Part of today's meeting of councillors on the Finance and Performance Committee was kept confidential to protect future tender processes. In sport, the New Zealand Breakers' latest signing concedes his career will most likely end with the club. The 35-year-old tall black Kirk Penny is returning home on a 3-year contract with the Australian Basketball League franchise. Penny, who played for the Breakers between 2007 and 2011, also had stints with the Miami Heat and the Los Angeles Clippers in the NBA. He says the timing's right to return to this side of the Tasman after playing the latest NBL season with the Illawarra Hawks.
A lot of players who, if they're given this opportunity, would take it, especially as your priorities shift and family and relationships become so important. It's an obvious move.
Kirk Penny. Sir Gordon Titchens has been forced to call in 3 injury replacements to his New Zealand Sevens side for the upcoming Singapore leg of the World Series. Peter Aki, Sam Dixon, Tim Mickelson and Lewis Ormond have all been ruled out following the Hong Kong Sevens, while DJ Forbes is also returning home as part of his plan to preserve himself for Olympic selection later this year. Antonio Kirikiri, Josh Van Leishout and Isaac Theoti will fly to Singapore tonight as cover. New Zealand will nominate 8 swimmers for this year's Rio Olympics. All 8 went under the Olympic qualifying times at recent meets. The swimmers are Corey Main, Matthew Hutchins, Lauren Boyle, Matthew Stanley, Glenn Snyders, Emma Robinson, Bradley Ashby and Helena Gassam. That's the news.
A convicted baby killer is paroled.
How can they let someone out that's never admitted guilt, never shown any remorse? If she's admitted guilt, totally different story.
Fair trials at risk.
There are no votes in being seen to be assisting those who represent criminals, but that's a very mistaken and misguided belief.
Court injunctions fail.
The minute I see an injunction, the interest is piqued. The internet now is such that information becomes broadly available very quickly.
Justice is served. Morning reports, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, the former Waikato dairy farmer turned legal cannabis dealer in Colorado, John Lord. And after 10, how a facial trauma surgeon from Wales is helping to stop street crime around the world. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Isolated showers turning to rain for a time overnight with heavy falls. Showers clearing from Auckland tomorrow morning. From Waikato to Whanganui, including Taihape, occasional rain with heavy and possibly thundery falls clearing from the south this evening and overnight. Manawatu, Hodowhenua and Te Kapiti Coast, fine spells, a few showers, clearing tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine today, occasional showers tomorrow. Wellington and Wairarapa, showers developing this afternoon, clearing tomorrow morning. Nelson and Buller, a few showers, clearing in Nelson this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Mostly fine for Westland. Fiordland, showers, some possibly heavy this evening. Marlborough, Canterbury, patchy rain clearing south of Christchurch this evening and elsewhere overnight. Otago and Southland, a few showers clearing in Otago and inland Southland this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. And the Chatham Islands, occasional showers. It's coming up to 9 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Katrina. Busy programme this evening. We're going to begin with Education Minister Hekia Parata. She's asked the Education Council to work with the Ministry of Education to investigate extending its powers to all people who work with children in schools, following the sentencing today of child rapist Robert Burrett. The school caretaker was today jailed for 19.5 years over 21 sex charges relating to a dozen girls aged between 5 and 12. He pleaded guilty to the offending, which involved girls from 2 Christchurch schools, including some with special needs. Education Minister Hekia Parata declined our invitation to be interviewed tonight. In a moment we'll hear from the Ministry of Education. But first, this from Conan Young, who was in court for sentencing.
Burrett's offending took place over 2 years until his arrest early last year and involved girls between 5 and 12. It happened on a school bus he drove and in a school shed he was able to lock from the inside. The names of both schools have been suppressed. Before he was sentenced today, the court heard a victim impact statement from a mother of one of the victims. The judge prohibited her voice being recorded, and the following extract has been read by an actor.
I feel like a useless parent. I blame myself for not being more cautious and for not knowing it was happening. I hate you and what you have done and feel disgusted and sickened by what you did. Every day that I walk into the school and see the shed, I cringe. I want to cry but hold it in for the sake of my children. My hope is that no child is ever allowed near you again.
None of the other victim impact statements were read out in court, but Justice Gerald Nation referred to them, including one which talked about the victim continuing to have flashbacks about the offences carried out against her.
Another report referred to the way her daughter appeared to deliberately try to cause herself pain and say over the years of the abuse she was going to kill herself. One report referred to a child having become disillusioned with the world and mistrustful of the true intentions of adults.
Burrett's offending was revealed after he abused a disabled girl on the school bus he drove. Today, the judge read out a victim impact statement paying tribute to the courage of the girl who spoke out about it.
Another parent said that although their loss was huge, their daughter's loss more. She had some small delight in knowing that one little disabled girl had told on him and that one day she would know how brave she was.
Justice Nation made reference to a probation report which said Burrett had failed to show any insight into the long-term consequences of his offending.
It also refers to the way you have dehumanised your victims, of your belief that at least certain of them enjoyed sex with adults and were not harmed emotionally and physically by this.
Justice Nation said the report stated this had allowed Burrett to justify his actions and there was a high likelihood he would re-offend if he was given the chance. Outside court, Burrett's lawyer, Rupert Glover, insisted his client regretted what he had done.
He's still struggling to come to grips with it. It's pretty significant what he did, and I think he's concerned that he had this problem that he really didn't appreciate the gravity of for so long.
Rupert Glover said there were no winners in the case which had impacted on the victims, their families and his client's family. He noted Burrett's wife was in court for her husband's sentencing.
She's been trying to support him. It's been a terrible shock for her, obviously, and I understand that some of the victims' families have expressed sympathy for her, and I think that's very decent of them and very much appreciated by her.
Justice Nation said while Burrett would come up for parole in 10 years, because of his lack of remorse, it was unlikely the 64-year-old would get out of jail before he turned 83. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Conan Young.
Robert Burrett taught for more than 40 years in schools across the country. He was a principal, deputy principal before working as a tutor, relief teacher and, as you heard, bus driver, amongst other jobs. Katrina Casey is the Minister of Education, Sector Enablement and Support Deputy Secretary. I asked her if she was satisfied with the Ministry's protection of the children at these schools.
This is an absolute tragedy, and any time something out of the ordinary and something this tragic happens, you always go back and you just search for any little clue, any piece of information. What did we know? What could we have done differently? And in this case, we've done that more than once because of the time period that it goes back over. And against what we knew at what time, we cannot find anything that we could have done differently.
According to the investigation by the New Zealand Herald, you do have on your records at the Ministry complaints relating to, and I quote, inappropriate comments and behaviour. Is that the case?
We have one complaint from May 2013 when he was a bus driver. And yes, that was about inappropriate comments. That complaint came through. The transport operator interviewed Burrett, and as a result of that interview went back to both the school and the parents. They were satisfied at the time, and the parents asked that the investigation not continue. And notwithstanding that, though, the transport operator moved the driver to a different route so that he had no contact with the student.
OK, Burrett was forced out of 2 previous schools for misconduct, which again included, and I quote, inappropriate behaviour with students. But in at least one of those cases, there was a secrecy clause around the nature and terms of his departure, preventing future employers from knowing why he had left. Is that appropriate?
No, that is not appropriate. And, governments over the years since that time have significantly strengthened the requirements and the legislation. So schools must make a mandatory report if a teacher or a principal leaves under any kind of a cloud around performance or misconduct, and they cannot, even if they do reach a settlement, they are still required to report to the Education Council.
So the kind of secrecy that protected him and enabled him to move into other schools with his reputation intact could not happen again?
The legislation has been changed so that it can't happen again.
Sorry, Katrina, that sounds slightly like you're hedging your bets there. On the ministry's behalf, are you saying it could not happen again?
I am saying that all of the conditions are in place to make sure that it never happens again. And I'm also saying that what we're going to do is significantly strengthen awareness with principals and boards of trustees around those provisions, so that they are reminded that they are breaking the law if they do not make a mandatory report if these conditions were to happen again.
So this is a message you're going to pass on very explicitly to principals and boards?
I believe that principals and boards already know that, and we know that they are much more cautious and they are making reports. But nevertheless, whenever you have such a serious, appalling incident like this, it is useful to use that occurrence to be able to remind people of what their roles and responsibilities actually are.
Yeah, looking after children and protecting children who are the most vulnerable people in our community. And Barrett not only went for vulnerable per se, he actually went for heightened vulnerability because some of these children had disabilities. This guy was as predatory as it's possible to imagine someone being in the circumstances he was in. And I just wonder if there were no red flags at all the ministry could have seen.
We have gone over and over that. We have gone right back to the 1990s, and we have looked at whether or not the complaints we did receive in May 2013, and then there were 2 different complaints after that point. Was there anything that would lead anybody to think that this was the kind of predator that you're describing? And there is absolutely nothing. And the complaints that were received were all addressed extremely quickly and at the time. And in fact, what triggered him to be going to prison for such a long time was a complaint that we acted on immediately we got it.
That was Katrina Casey from the Ministry of Education. If you're one of the parents who is aware of Robert Barrett's passing through various schools and you believe complaints were raised against him, we would love to hear from you. We did ask to talk to the Education Minister, Hekia Parata. She was unavailable to appear on our program live tonight. But we'll hear more from her from a media stand-up she did in Parliament. We'll play that after 6 o'clock. It's 18.5 minutes past 5. It's just been revealed that the Prime Minister, John Key, has a short-term deposit with a company specialising in foreign trusts. The MP's Register of Pecuniary Interests published this information this afternoon. It says the deposit is with Antipodes Trusts Group Limited, a company that specialises in those foreign trusts. The government has been criticised for allowing the country to be used by wealthy people from around the world as a tax haven through the use of these foreign trusts. On its website, Antipodes Trust Group touts the use of New Zealand-based foreign trusts to, quote, carefully manage the intergenerational transfer of wealth, end quote, and lists the benefit of the country's legal structure. A spokesperson for Mr Key says the cash deposit was registered with his personal lawyer, Ken Whitney, in the Pecuniary Register last year, but Mr Whitney has since moved firms to Antipodes and the cash deposit went with him. We are trying to find out more about this. Meanwhile, in Parliament this afternoon, the Labour Party leader, Andrew Little, has tabled his personal tax record and he's challenged John Key to do the same. Our political editor, Jane Patterson, has filed this report.
I seek leave to table my income tax records going back to the year ending 31 March 2010 to the year ending 31 March 2016.
Leave is sought to table those particular records. Is there any objection? There is none, they can be tabled.
Andrew Little made his tax records public, citing the example of Britain's David Cameron and throwing down the gauntlet to the Prime Minister.
Will he join me and release his tax records to dispel rumours that he has benefited from the use of tax havens?
Here, Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Firstly, Mr Speaker, there are no such rumours. Secondly, Mr Speaker, I don't think the member actually should table his tax return. I think he should table his CV, because he'll be out looking for a new job soon.
Mr Little then asked John Key about a law change made under Nationals' watch.
Why did he push through a law in 2011, which Labor opposed, that cut the tax rate for foreign funds to zero, a move that PricewaterhouseCoopers said put New Zealand on a par with renowned tax havens like Ireland, Luxembourg and the Caymans?
Speaker,
Right Honourable Prime
member would
Minister.
need to direct that question to the Minister of Revenue. I don't have those facts.
Supplementary.
Mr Little went on to question Mr Key about comments he made in 2005.
Does he think he has achieved his goal of making New Zealand the Jersey of the South Pacific? And don't pull the wool over our eyes.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I do think there's a role for New Zealand in the provision of financial services. It's part of a diversified economy. I think we can do that quite successfully.
The government has appointed the tax expert John Shewan to investigate disclosure rules for foreign trusts in New Zealand. However, critics say the former PwC chair is too close to the finance industry. The Greens co-leader James Shaw asked the Finance Minister Bill English about Mr Shewan's suitability.
Does the Minister think that having a single poacher act as gamekeeper will restore public confidence in our foreign trust industry?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I reject the member's characterisation. Look, the fact is nothing that we could do will satisfy the Greens, who are fundamentally opposed to capitalism, profit, taxation, people getting ahead and making money.
John Shewan says he's not in a popularity contest and should be judged on the content of his final report, which is due to be completed by the end of June. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
And just repeating that information, it has just been revealed that the Prime Minister has a short-term deposit with a company specialising in foreign trusts. The MP's Register of Pecuniary Interests published that information this afternoon. We are seeking elaboration on the circumstances and details around that. Just came up to 23 minutes past 5. Coming up on Checkpoint, a Northland jury has found a well-known man accused of indecent acts against 2 girls not guilty on all 12 counts. We'll go to our reporter in Northland who was in the court. The company behind Dunedin Hospital's new meals reveals it's appointed 2 patient experience coordinators to monitor the response to the food they're serving patients. We asked them to explain that shortly, and later in the program why a $104 million high-rise office tower Auckland City Council bought just a few years ago will need to be reclad, plus Kirk Penny returns to the breakers. All of that and more coming up. The government is taking the highly contentious decision about fluoridation of local water supplies away from local authorities. It plans to introduce legislation later this year to move the decision-making process to the DHBs, which currently provide expert advice on fluoridation, to local authorities. But an anti-fluoride campaigner says the government is trying to make fluoridation mandatory. Catherine Hutton reports.
The President of Local Government New Zealand, Lawrence Yule, says the only reason councils are involved is because they own the water pipes, which is the most convenient way of distributing fluoride.
Councils and councillors aren't elected really to have any knowledge about health, but yet they get bought into it by the fact that people wish to use our water supplies. And then they use council processes and politics to influence that decision. Some people have referendums, but there's been lots of court cases. We just think that is actually something that ratepayers shouldn't be funding.
The Health Minister, Jonathan Coleman, says DHBs have the knowledge and support to make the decision. Currently, about half the population drinks fluoridated water, and Dr Coleman says he'd like that to increase.
The CDC in Atlanta says fluoridation of water is one of the 10 greatest public health achievements of the 20th century. The WHO totally support it. If we can get more fluoride in the water, they tell me that we'll be able to decrease tooth decay by 40% in children, up to 30% in adults, and that can only be a good thing.
There have been some high-profile and costly battles over fluoride in recent years. In 2013, Hamilton spent over a year fighting to put fluoride in its water, and this year the Whakatane District Council voted to include fluoride in its water supply 9 days after voting to remove it. Lawrence Yule says anti-fluoride campaigners have targeted smaller councils.
It's part of a campaign to pick off the most vulnerable. So smaller councils who are having this conversation, they've thrown a whole lot of legal might against them.
Smaller councils like the South Taranaki District Council, which has spent the last 3 years embroiled in a legal battle with anti-fluoride campaigners, costing $250,000. Mayor Ross Dunlop says the legal spat started after health officials recommended fluoridating the water supply in Waverley and Patea, following concerns about the state of children's teeth. Mr Dunlop says despite winning its case, the council is reluctant to add fluoride until the outcome of a Court of Appeal hearing in August is known. Anti-fluoride campaigner Mary Byrne denies smaller councils have been targeted, saying her group, Fluoride Free New Zealand, talks to many councils. She's worried by today's announcement.
The government is trying to take control from the councils because they know that the more people know about fluoridation, the less likely they are to be in favour of it. So they're trying to take the whole discussion away from the public and virtually make it mandatory.
But Dr Coleman says by allowing DHBs to make the decision, people can still have their say through the elected representatives. The government plans to introduce legislation later in the year and is confident it has the numbers to pass it. For Checkpoint, Catherine Hutton.
The well-known man at the centre of a Northland indecency trial has applied for permanent name suppression. The man was this afternoon acquitted on all 12 charges of sexual contact with 2 girls after a week-long trial in the High Court at Whangarei. Lois Williams was in the court today for the verdict and joins us on the line from Whangarei. Lois, what was the reaction in the courtroom?
Well, John, there was a long list of verdicts, of course, because there were 12 separate charges. So there were 12 not guilty verdicts read out in this long string, and there was dead silence while that was happening. And then with the last not guilty read out by the foreman, there was a sort of release of pent-up emotion, I guess, in the public seats. There was applause from family and friends of the man, and someone called out, well done. And, his old dad was sobbing openly with relief. Everyone was embracing and shaking hands. It was pretty emotional.
The process of reaching the verdict, not without a hiccup in the morning?
No. The jury actually came back about 11 o'clock and they said they were deadlocked. And that raised tension levels. The judge actually urged them to keep trying. He said if they could keep trying a bit longer, they would be allowed to have a majority verdict. So the man's family was looking pretty stressed by that. So when they came back in at 2 and said they had a verdict, that was unexpected, and you could just sort of feel the tension shoot up in the courtroom.
Yeah. The man's name has been suppressed throughout this trial. I think probably one of the heaviest blanket suppression orders that we've seen for a very long time. It's made it very tricky to report this case, hasn't it, Lois?
Well, yes, it has. I'm not sure how much heavier it's been than other similar cases. It's not unusual for this to happen. There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of adverse comment about the suppression. But as the judge said, that the main reason that the man's name was suppressed was to protect the identity of the girls. And their names, of course, are suppressed by statute. So, but this did mean that a lot of the evidence couldn't be published. We couldn't report it because it had a bearing on that and because it could have possibly identified the man or the girls.
And the man himself is now going for permanent name suppression?
Yes, he is. His defence team filed their submission this afternoon after the verdict for permanent suppression, and Justice Venning has said that he will consider this. He's reserved his decision, but it's likely to be out within the next couple of days.
Lois Williams live on the phone from Whangarei. Thank you so much, Lois. The time on Checkpoint is 5:29. Feedback coming in, particularly on the issue of the PM and this news that he has a tax deposit with a company, a cash deposit with a company that specialises in foreign trusts. It's not surprising, says this listener, that the PM has a foreign trust account. He's wealthy, and this is what wealthy, powerful people do, create processes and laws that protect their interests. The shame is he doesn't see anything wrong with it. I think in this case, and we are trying to seek clarity on this, it is only breaking news, I don't think this is a foreign trust account. I think this is a company that specialises in trust, but it is very much a New Zealand company. We will try and ascertain the factual veracity of my ad-libbing there. John, says Judy, the Prime Minister John Key always says in relation to surveillance that if you've done nothing wrong, you've nothing to fear. Surely this would apply and make it easy for him to release his tax returns, says Judy. And someone asked, why does Minister Coleman support water fluoridation but not a tax on sugar sweetened beverages? I think he's joining us after 6 o'clock. I'll put that question aside and ask him. Coming up, the Labour and Māori parties say they may withdraw their support for a law change to create a massive ocean sanctuary around the Kermadec Islands. The company behind Dunedin Hospital's new meals reveals it's appointed 2, wait for this, patient experience coordinators to monitor the response to the food they're serving patients. It's going to follow the food around the wards and gather feedback. It comes after multiple complaints about the quality of the food and why a $104 million high-rise office tower Auckland Council bought just a few years ago will need to be reclad. All of that and more coming up in the next 30 minutes. But first, here's Katrina with the headlines.
The government wants mandatory reporting for all school support staff, not just teachers and principals. It comes in the wake of today's sentencing of a school caretaker and bus driver, Robert Burrett, in Christchurch for sexually assaulting a dozen schoolgirls. He was sentenced to almost 20 years in prison. The Education Minister, Hekia Parata, says caretakers and school bus drivers should be reported if their conduct or competence is in doubt. The register containing details of MPs' finances states the Prime Minister has a short-term deposit with a firm specialising in foreign trusts. This comes as the government is responding to criticisms New Zealand is being used by wealthy foreigners as a tax haven through the use of foreign trusts. The government plans to introduce legislation later in the year transferring responsibility for fluoridation from councils to district health boards. It's confident it has the numbers to pass it. The Health Minister says DHBs have the knowledge and support to make the decisions. A prominent man charged with indecently touching 2 girls has been acquitted in a High Court trial in Whangarei. The jury unanimously found him not guilty on all 12 counts. His lawyers have applied for permanent name suppression. The Māori Party says its continued support for a massive ocean sanctuary around the Kermadec Islands is not guaranteed, with Māori forced to choose sides. The Fisheries Trust, Te Ohu Kaimoana, is taking legal action, and several prominent Māori leaders have come out publicly opposing the government over the planned sanctuary. Auckland councillors have voted behind closed doors to start the process to salvage the council's office tower. The exterior of the 29-storey building is corroding and there's a risk that large granite slabs of cladding will fall. It is now 27 to 6. That's exactly right. So I'll be back at 6 o'clock with more news.
We should say we've got a digital clock in the studio,
hard.
And we just want one with hands, don't we? So
I
we know
want
what
a
it is
face.
before the hour,
Yes.
not one hour. And no one cares what it is after the hour.
New people can read that. I'm old. I need one that's proper.
Young people can read that.
Young people, exactly.
Let's turn to business. Thanks, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now. And a young person. We're going to be joined by an example of the aforementioned genre. Jonathan Mitchell is back in the chair tonight. Jonathan, welcome from Wellington on behalf of young people everywhere. And a medical software developer announces another deal.
That's right. Well, it was a fairly quiet day on the markets, John, but Orion Health was one of the standout performers. Its shares gained 4%, off the back of announcing that it signed a deal to sell its patient record management software to a couple of hospitals in London and get its technology going in Scotland. So it's been a busy old year for Orion Health. It's signed contracts all over the place. France, Britain is mentioned, the United States and Australia. And just to give an example of its size now, its software products are handling records for about 90 million patients. through 25 countries. So it's big business now for a firm that was listed a couple of years ago and formed back in 1993. And these new contracts that it's signing are helping to feed through into its recurring revenue, and that's the money coming in each month from the deals that are being signed. And that recurring revenue accounts for 40% of its overall revenue and is considered quite a key measure of the company's growth. And that has been growing, but it has been reporting losses in recent years as it reinvests the money that it does make back into research and development and growth. And the chief executive, though, Ian McRae, has told RNZ today that it's going to announce its guide for profit and its outlook on that next month. So we'll get a good steer of when it will make a profit.
Thanks, Jonathan. What happened on the markets today?
Well, barely changed, John. Up a point, 6726. And the dollar about the same today, 68.8 US cents, and hovering around 90 Australian.
Jonathan Mitchell live from Wellington. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. For weeks now, we've been covering the food a company called Compass is providing to Dunedin Hospital, Southland Hospital and Meals on Wheels recipients in the Otago Southland area. It goes a little bit like this. Compass tells us the food is pretty good. The minister told us the food was pretty good. Everyone else tells us the food is rubbish. It really is that starkly polarised. Regular listeners will know we've received emails, texts, photos and lurid descriptions, all of it detailing food the patients themselves describe as less than appetising, and we're being charitable there. Today this appears to have come to a head with Lauren Scott from Compass meeting with the Southern DHB.
I did. I had a meeting with some of their executive this morning to talk about what initiatives we can put in place in light of some of the ongoing feedback that we've received through from patients and staff about the food services.
And from the DHB itself, were they unhappy about the quality of the food?
Look, I think the DHB is really supportive of us ensuring that we provide great service to patients and to staff, and they're just wanting to work alongside of us to iron out any issues that have been identified and make sure that we deliver on that service.
Okay, so were the DHB unhappy with the quality of the food?
The DHB haven't commented specifically on the quality of the food. I think our focus at the moment is just ensuring that we understand fully what the patient experience is and what their feedback is and making sure that we act on that.
Right, so you had a conversation with the DHB about the quality of the food without the DHB ever discussing the quality of the food?
We haven't talked specifically about the quality of the food. What we've talked about is the feedback that we've received from patients about what their experience is.
Of the quality of the food?
Of the quality of the food. Right. Yeah. What we're going to do is put in place patient experience coordinators that will work across the 3 hospitals that we provide services for in Southern DHB.
And what will they do? What will they do, Lauren? What will their job be?
So their job will be to be on the wards and working across the wards at the meal times, and they'll be able to see the meal that the patient receives, see if there is an actual problem with the quality of that meal, or see if the problem relates to maybe the menu selection or that they weren't offered the right type of menu choice, or whether or not the problem relates to the type of dietary requirement.
Okay, so they're effectively gathering feedback, are they?
They're gathering feedback. They're trying to understand what the root of the problem is for an individual patient.
Lauren, surely the root of the problem is the quality of the food. I mean, the food is, if we look at all the feedback we've got, and I've got some in front of me now, this is regurgitated vomit, someone says. Lamb and rice casserole, but no meat, rice cold, undercooked. This man, John from Wanaka, texted us last night. Overnight in Dunedin Hospital on Thursday, food was revolting. No one on my ward could eat it. Now, surely, if you put someone out, aren't you just going to get the same feedback?
Sometimes the feedback is related to the quality of the meal that an individual receives, and in that instance, a patient experience coordinator would be able to rectify that issue immediately. So,
in what way? Would they have a garnish? Would they have some Parmesan cheese? In what way would they rectify it immediately?
They would supply a replacement alternative meal for that particular patient. But there are some challenges that we face around patients being on dietary restrictions and potentially on the wrong dietary restrictions. So we need to make sure that we're understanding exactly what the problem is with each of the meals. I mean, you raised some points around the feedback that we've received about specific meals. We are taking that feedback seriously. But like I said, we have also received a lot of positive feedback about specific meals as well. So we need to consider both of those viewpoints.
Will the food get better?
We're always working to improve the food that we provide every day.
Are you every day? Because you and I mean, you're a good sport. You always come on when we ask, but I think this is the third time I've spoken to you, and it's fundamentally the same conversation every time. So if you are working to improve the quality of the food every day, why isn't it getting any better?
I think we've identified some specific dishes, and I think I did talk about those last week, that we have changed out of the menu. We're always looking at how the food is cooked by our staff in the kitchens. I know there have been reports that the kitchens have closed. The kitchens continue to operate and the food continues to be heated on site and plated according to the individual.
Hold on a second. Okay, so you use the word cooked by your staff in the kitchens, but that actually just means heated, doesn't it?
So we use a variety of different types of food. So some of the food does come in pre-prepared. Some of the food is cooked fresh on the day. Some of the food is pre-packaged individual portions, things like yogurt. So it is a variety of different ways that we use to prepare a patient meal, and that is all done in the hospital kitchen.
This is Lauren Scott speaking on behalf of Compass. Once again, we'd love to hear from you. Do the quality of your meals improve over the next week or two? Look, we've just got a 58-second package on this from Reuters, but we didn't want it to pass unobserved because it's a big story, and it was a really big story at the time. Goldman Sachs has agreed to pay US $5 billion to settle claims that it misled mortgage investors during the global financial crisis. You will remember this, of course, the subprime, the lending. A lot of American merchant banks, in fact, a lot of banks up to their neck in it. The New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman announced the settlement, which is related to the packaging, security, marketing, sale and issuing of residential mortgage bank securities between 2005 and 2007.
Today, our Federal State Working Group, which I co-chair, is announcing a new $5 billion settlement with Goldman Sachs to resolve claims over the bank's deceptive practices leading up to the housing crash. Of that, New York and New York families and communities will receive $670 million in cash and consumer relief. This settlement will help thousands of families with principal forgiveness get to obtain write-downs of their mortgage debt so they can avoid foreclosure and stay in their homes. It will help to finance multifamily affordable housing projects. It will fund land banks and local code enforcement efforts, and is really another major step in the fight for justice for the families and communities that were devastated when a combination of reckless deregulation and abusive practices by a relatively small number of financial firms brought the American economy to its knees in 2008.
Not just the American economy, of course. That was a contagious little virus, that one. 2008, $5 billion Goldman Sachs to pay out. The high-rise office tower that Auckland Council bought a few years ago is failing, and any one of the large granite slabs that make up its exterior could fall at any time. Councillors have been meeting today to discuss just what to do about the $104 million building, and they've decided late this afternoon to start finding ways to fix it. The building is 29 stories tall and just 25 years old, and its cladding is failing far earlier than anyone expected. Kim Baker-Wilson has been at today's council meeting. Kim, I meant to ask you a question, but I just want to say you tweeted from the council meeting, isn't it apt, appropriate or ironic, or all of the above, that a city in which the council has been beset by disastrous problems around the cladding in buildings bought a building with dodgy cladding? It's mad, isn't it?
At this same committee meeting today, we had a council officer come in and give a report that he comes and gives every 2 months on how things are going in the residential building sector. So he gave updates on how many buildings are failing their inspections, and it was incidentally quite a lot. And a councillor at that point said, look, the irony is not lost on us here, that we're about to discuss the failure of our own council building. So this building is actually, if we had a window, we could actually see it. It's quite an imposing building. Most Aucklanders would know it. And it really stems back to
It used to be the ASB's head office, didn't it? And it's got those strange escalators that sort of travel through the heart of it from one street down to another.
So it's right in the heart of Auckland Central, partly why the council chose it, of course. Stems back to the super city. The council now, though, has quite a super problem on its hands. It is only 25 years old. The exterior cladding is made up of large granite slabs. They are now at risk of falling off at any time. People who are in Auckland Central just the other weekend might have seen a helicopter flying overhead. It was actually taking scaffolding to that building. They're starting work as quick as they can to put some pieces of scaffolding up the top and put some measures at the top and the bottom to catch anything that falls off that building.
Did they get a discount on purchase as a result of this? How much did they know when they bought it? What do we understand about the circumstances of the purchase, the due diligence, and what they knew about the building?
Councillors today certainly wanted to know about that. Who knew what? When was it known? How much were people told? The council got the building for $104 million. They did not do a full due diligence, full review of the building at the time. They thought at the time it was simply too expensive to do that. They did get a slight...
I just want to go to the fetal position as you say that. Well, after all the leaky homes, all the leaky buildings in this city, the notion that the council spent $100 million without...
Too expensive. They said it couldn't be practically done. They got a slight discount here. So off that, $1.1 million is the discount they got. Councillor Mike Lee is telling me today that as part of that deal of getting that small discount in the scheme of things, that the council actually had to waive its right to any warranty with this building. So that's going to be another problem that's cropping up here. Those councillors are quite agitated by this. They want to know what's gone on. Today they were meeting behind closed doors in secret in a confidential meeting, and that's because they need to protect, they say, the tender process and the procurement process to fix this mess. So a figure has been bandied about today. There's no doubt it's going to cost millions of dollars to fix. How much, we just don't know at this stage.
Okay. What was the outcome of the meeting? Do you know the secret behind closed doors cone of silence meeting?
All we've been told is that there has been a decision made by those councillors to really get things going, to look at what's needed to fix this and to get things to fix them. The new panels are designed to look and feel the same as the ones that are up there now, so it's going to look exactly the same pretty much. The panels, though, the raw material has to come from France, comes all the way to New Zealand. We do something here to make it into its final product and put it on that building. In the meantime, though, it's corroding. There's safety issues with that building. They say it's extremely unlikely that cladding will fall off. There's nothing wrong with the structure of the building, but nonetheless there is that risk that something could fall off it.
Kim Baker-Wilson, who was at the meeting or locked outside the meeting or all of the above. Thanks so much, Kim. We really appreciate it. The Labour and Māori parties say they may withdraw their support for a law change to create a massive ocean sanctuary around the Kermadec Islands. It follows the Māori Fisheries Trust, Te Ohu Kaimoana, taking legal action, and several prominent Māori leaders publicly opposing the sanctuary, arguing the government has ignored the impact it will have on iwi fishing interests. Here's our political reporter, May Heron.
The Māori Party says while it supported the Kermadec Sanctuary Bill through its first reading, its continued support is not guaranteed. Its co-leader, Marama Fox, says the government should have consulted with more iwi and should now rethink its position. She says Māori should not have been forced to take sides.
I mean, we've supported Ohu Kaimoana's right to take this to court. Their property rights have been diminished. And in fact, this is the government saying that no matter what your settlements are, if we choose to change the rules halfway down the road, we'll do that and ignore everything that we've already put into law.
Legislation putting in place a sanctuary, which would be twice the size of New Zealand's land area, passed its first reading last month with unanimous support and is now being considered by a parliamentary select committee. The Labour leader, Andrew Little, says his party is also reconsidering its support based on what the committee reports back with.
Te Ohu Kaimoana is saying that they haven't had proper consultation. We haven't got to the point of withdrawing our support, but we certainly at this point share those concerns. We'll have a reconsideration in due course about what happens, what our stance on the bill is.
A negotiator of the 1992 Māori fisheries settlement, Te Tipene O'Regan, says the Kermadec Sanctuary has only come about due to overseas pressure. But the government says that's not the case. The Prime Minister, John Campbell, says there's a long list of high-profile people who support the sanctuary, including Hollywood director James Cameron, who Mr Campbell says has brought it up with him a few times. But John Campbell says he was not being lobbied.
I took the view as Prime Minister it was the right thing to do. I stand by that view. You know, the people are entitled to have a view about whether they think we've met our obligations around treaty rights. We'll contest all of that in court.
Other groups like the World Wildlife Fund, Forest and Bird and the Pew Charitable Trust have been pushing for the sanctuary for years. The Environment Minister, Nick Smith, says he's had conversations about the Kermadecs with the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, and other officials from Australia, Britain and Chile. But Dr Smith also says the decision to create a sanctuary was not due to international pressure.
New Zealand is working with our overseas partners and saying we need a network of marine protected areas in the Pacific. But what has influenced the government has been the strong passion of tens of thousands of New Zealanders who want to see New Zealand stepping up to the plate on protecting our oceans.
The Māori Fisheries Trust, Te Ohu Kaimoana, filed a case against the Kermadec Sanctuary in the High Court in Wellington last month and expects to find out in the next fortnight when the case will be heard. From Parliament for Checkpoint, May Heron.
10.5 minutes to 6. Leonard Nattrass Berquist is one of only two people who know what happened inside Unit 1 at Ascot Epsom Motel, where a man was fatally bashed. He was 17 years old when he says he was taken to the motel by a 54-year-old man that he met on Auckland's Queen Street a few weeks before. He and his friend Bowen Wallace-Loretz have denied charges of murdering Ihai Gilman-Harris and are on trial in the High Court in Auckland. Giving evidence in his own defence today, he told the court he was sexually assaulted by Mr Gilman-Harris before a struggle ensued, and his friend Mr Wallace-Loretz used a bottle to hit Mr Gilman-Harris in the head twice. Our Auckland court reporter Edward Gay was in court and he joins us in the studio now. Welcome, Edward. The night we are told, you were told in court, started with a drinking session?
Yeah, that's right. Mr Wallace-Loretz said that Mr Gilman-Harris gave him and his friend this box of premix bourbon, 18 cans in this box, and that they drank them through the early hours of the morning. That's December 27 in 2014. He said while they were drinking on a bench in Kingsland, Mr Gilman-Harris approached his friend and offered $1,000 to his friend to perform a sex act, and he said his friend refused outright. He said that later on that morning, Mr Gilman-Harris drove them around Auckland. They drove Mission Bay, up through Pakuranga, and then back into Auckland Central, back to Epsom, where he said that they planned to sleep in this hotel to sort of sleep the drink off. Text messages, though, between the two teenagers show that they talk of what they say, rolling Mr Gilman-Harris. And one of the messages says, take him motel and we'll smoke him there. Mr Wallace-Loretz said he was just saying whatever came into his head. These text messages were just whatever was in his mind at the time, and that he didn't mean what he was texting.
So the prosecution's produced these text messages, obviously, as part of the case against the two accused.
That's right.
Yeah. So they did end up going to a motel?
Yeah, that's right. Mr Nattrass Berquist said he wanted just to sleep the drink off, and when they got to this Epsom Ascot motel, Mr Gilman-Harris pulled out a bottle of alcohol. He put that on the bench, and he also pulled out his laptop. And this was while Mr Wallace-Loretz was in the loo. And Mr Gilman-Harris, he says, played a pornography film on his laptop, and Mr Nattrass Berquist said he didn't want any part of that. He slammed the laptop lid closed, and he said that at that point Mr Gilman-Harris got angry. He said that he squared up and his eyes went black, and that Mr Gilman-Harris said that the two teenagers had been dicking him around and it was time that they needed to pay now. He said he was thrown onto the bed and sexually assaulted, and also Mr Gilman-Harris grabbed him around the neck. And Mr Nattrass Berquist, he sort of choked up at one point, and he said that he basically went blank, he went numb, he sort of had this kind of out-of-body experience. But he said that once Mr Wallace-Loretz came back from the loo, he eventually struck Mr Gilman-Harris over the head with this bottle of alcohol 2 times. He said that Mr Nattrass Berquist, he said that he was extremely grateful for what his friend had done, that he was that he was scared for his life.
Okay, what do we know about the condition Mr Gilman-Harris was in when the two accused left?
Well, Mr Nattrass Berquist says that Mr Gilman-Harris was still conscious, he was still walking around, that he actually told the teenagers that he was sorry for what had happened. He said that at that point the pair took Mr Gilman-Harris's Range Rover. They found Mr Gilman-Harris's bum bag underneath the seat. They pulled out $400 in cash. And later on, when they found out, I think it was a day later, they found out that Mr. Gilman Harris had actually died. And Mr. Natras Berquist described how he and Mr. Wallace Loretz were crying non-stop, that they felt terrible for what had happened, that no one deserved what had happened to Mr. Gilman Harris. And he's been cross-examined now by the Crown Prosecutor David Johnston.
Edward Gay, thank you very much indeed. That is the trail at the High Court in Auckland. Appreciate it. Edward, New Zealand Breakers will welcome home a high-flying Kiwi for the twilight of his basketball career. Kirk Penny, one of the greats really in the history of the sport of New Zealand, has signed on to play for his hometown club for the next 3 seasons. He's played all over the world, including stints with the NBA's Miami Heat, Los Angeles Clippers, and in some of Europe's top leagues. The 35-year-old Tall Black most recently played for the Illawarra Hawks in this year's Australian National Basketball League. Of course, the ANBL is what the Breakers are in too. Matt Chatterton reports.
Penny turned down multiple offers from NBL clubs, instead deciding to return to where it all began for a last hurrah. He says he opted to put his family first.
A lot of players who, if they're given this opportunity, would take it, especially as your priorities shift and family and relationships become so important. It's an obvious move.
Another incentive for the shooting guard is the prospect of rejoining his former teammates, who have since hung up their jerseys, Dylan Boucher and Paul Henare. Boucher, who was recently appointed General Manager of the Breakers, says it's great to have Penny back on the right side of the Tasman.
We've got a very strong friendship. Kirk's been a teammate of ours for a long time. Played with him, against him for a long time. So, yeah, they certainly come into it. And we certainly pulled on his heartstrings a little bit as well.
With the signing of Penny and re-signing of centre Alex Pledger just last week, the Breakers' line-up for next season is starting to take shape, much to the joy of new head coach Paul Henare.
We've obviously got great threats on the wings already, and Corey Webster and Tom Abercrombie, but bringing someone like Kirk in just gives us that added punch.
Henare says his Breakers side now features 5 of arguably New Zealand's best basketball players, which puts them in good stead to win their 5th NBL title next year. For Checkpoint, Matt Chatterton.
We're going to go to the United States now. Abortion, a big issue there. You will recall Donald Trump's comments about women who have abortions being punished. Well, abortion clinics are closing in the US at a record pace. In 5 states, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota and Wyoming, just 1 remains for the 5 states. American women were having fewer abortions before clinic closings accelerated in the last couple of years. But the number of doctors trained to provide the procedure has risen. All of this is very confusing. Mana Rabi from Reuters explains.
Across the U.S., scores of abortion clinics are shutting their doors. That's because states are enacting laws making it harder to get an abortion, imposing waiting periods, mandating counseling, or holding abortion clinics to standards meant for surgical centers. All this as fewer medical institutions provide young doctors with abortion training. And yet, the number of doctors trained to provide the procedure is surging. 2 little-known training programs are largely responsible. Between them, they're training more than 1,000 doctors and medical students each year in reproductive services, from contraception to all kinds of abortion.
We're seeing that as more state restrictions are in place and as more hospitals merge with Catholic institutions, the available training for abortion services is becoming less and less.
Among the new abortion providers benefiting from the increased training is Dr. Jennifer Conti. She teaches reproductive care at Stanford University in Northern California and feels an obligation to be vocal about abortion.
It's a trade-off. You either choose to move to one of these places where it's difficult to access abortions and be an abortion provider, and then you don't put yourself out there in the media because of concerns of safety, or you're in a place where it's a little safer and you do put yourself out there because you're acting on the behalf of everyone.
The problem is, most of the new providers end up working near where they trained, and not in the many southern and Midwestern states that have the most restrictive abortion laws. Like Texas, which passed a law that's now being challenged at the U.S. Supreme Court as it gets ready to hear its first abortion case in nearly a decade.
That report from Reuters. Home again before the 6 o'clock news. A popular octopus has pulled off a great escape from the National Aquarium. Inky, the common octopus, nothing common about Inky, took advantage of his tank's lid being slightly ajar 3 months ago and fled to the Pacific. This is the manager of the Napier Aquarium, Rob Yarrell.
2014, very popular octopus with the staff and the public as well. Octopus in general are incredible escape artists, and they can fit through very, very small spaces, even quite a large octopus. They can squeeze down to the size of their mouth, which is the only really hard part of the body. It's a beak, very much like a parrot beak. So this particular day, maintenance work had been carried out, and the lid had been left just with a slightly ajar, just slightly, and he found this rather tempting, climbed out, and was able to make his way across the floor. Now, being an aquarium, we have drains dotted all over the place in case of large leaks or spillages and things like that, and we draw water from the ocean, we use it, and then we send it back again. And he managed to make his way to one of the drain holes that go back to the ocean, and off he went, and didn't even leave us a message. He just off and went. And the next day we found the trail where he'd gone and where he'd climbed down, and we checked the pipeworks, and he had gone back to sea.
Kia ora everyone, you're with Checkpoint with John Campbell and RNZ National and our excellent team. Thank you for joining us however you're doing so. Don't forget we are live streaming on our website, and you can get us on Freeview channel 50, and we're on the wireless as Radio New Zealand has been for roughly 473 years. Katrina Backer. Tonight, why is the Health Minister taking decision-making about fluoride away from councils and giving it to DHBs? We've got Hekia Parata coming up on this Robert Burritt case and his passage through so many schools. Water quality in Canterbury. Why is it so good and so bad, it seems? Does the law change? Does the law need to change to allow Māori to deal with death in their own way? And more in the next 29 minutes. But first, here is the news with Katrina Batten.
Ngā mihi nui, good evening. The government wants mandatory reporting for all school support staff, not just teachers and principals. It comes in the wake of today's sentencing of a school caretaker and bus driver, Robert Burritt, at the High Court in Christchurch for sexually assaulting a dozen schoolgirls. The Education Minister, Hekia Parata, says at the moment only teachers and principals can be reported if their conduct or competence is in doubt. She says it should be extended to all school employees. The founder of the Sensible Sentencing Trust, Garth McVicker, says the prison term handed down to Burritt reflects a culture change in the justice system.
We can't cure these pedophiles, and we know that. So the only way we can keep our kids and the public safe from them is to make sure they're locked away for a good period of time. And the judge has done that, and we congratulate him.
Garth McVicker says Burritt's chance of parole in 10 years is slim. The register, containing details of MPs' finances, states the Prime Minister has a short-term deposit with a firm specialising in foreign trusts. The government has been responding to criticisms New Zealand is being used by wealthy people around the world as a tax haven through the use of foreign trusts. On its website, the Antipodes Trust Group touts the use of New Zealand-based foreign trusts and lists the benefits of this country's legal structure. A spokesperson for Mr Key says the cash deposit was registered with his personal lawyer, Ken Whitney, in the Pecuniary Register last year, but Mr Whitney has since moved firms to Antipodes. The government says it will be up to individual district health boards to decide how they'll introduce fluoride into the water supply. Today, the government announced a proposal to shift responsibility for fluoride from local councils to DHBs, which currently provide expert advice on fluoridation to local authorities. It says the boards have the knowledge and support to make the decision. The Associate Health Minister, Peter Dunn, says the DHBs will have to consult the public for their views on fluoridation.
They will have to have some form of public input into their decision making. Whether they will make decisions to review what currently exists, in other words, they might just roll over existing fluoridation arrangements, that will be for them to decide. That will be our expectation that that's what they do.
The Associate Health Minister, Peter Dunn. The housing market is confounding predictions that it's cooling off, with new data showing a rise in prices and sales in March. The Real Estate Institute says seasonally adjusted median prices gained more than 5% nationally on February and were nearly 3.5% higher on a year earlier. The national median house price gained 4% on a year ago to $495,000, and in Auckland it's pushed to a record $820,000. The Institute's chief executive, Colleen Milne, says Auckland is lifting confidence throughout the country.
There were recent fears that the Auckland market was cooling off, and there was definitely regulatory influences, coming through late last year and January, March, and I think we're just seeing the market picking up again.
Colleen Milne expects the national housing market to remain robust through the year. Republican leaders in the United States are hitting back at Donald Trump after he described the process of choosing the party's presidential candidate as crooked. His comments came after his rival, Ted Cruz, swept the board in Colorado, where delegates are selected by senior party activists. Mr. Trump is still well ahead in the Republican race, but could lose if he doesn't get enough delegates in the state-by-state contests. Our Washington correspondent Simon Marks reports.
Not for the first time, Donald Trump finds himself at odds with the grandees of the very political party that he wants to lead in November. He says the process of choosing the party's presidential nominee is rigged and crooked. He's intimating that if he doesn't become the candidate, he might run as an independent, splitting the vote and handing the Democrats the White House on a plate. Republican leaders are trying to damp the dispute down, saying there will be no games. But Mr. Trump doesn't seem to believe it. Simon Marks, RNZ News, Washington.
In sport, the All Blacks Sevens veteran DJ Forbes is returning home to rest following the Hong Kong Sevens to revive himself for Olympic selection later this year. Tim Mickelson, Peter Aki, Sam Dixon and Lewis Ormond are also returning to New Zealand. They've been ruled out of the upcoming Singapore World Series event due to injury. Antonio Kirikiri, Josh van Lieshout and Isaac Teoti will fly to Singapore tonight as cover. The Northern Mystics coach Debbie Fuller says Tall Ferns basketball convert Megan Craig is still a work in progress. The Mystics remain winless in the Trans-Tasman Netball Championship after being beaten 54-44 by the West Coast Fever in Auckland last night. Leading at half-time, the hosts were outscored by 9 goals in the final quarter as shooters Craig and Catherine Latu struggled. While Fuller says she's happy with Craig's performance, the mid-quarters are having trouble adjusting to the 2-metre tall shooter's style of play. The Warriors halves import Jeff Robson has been dropped from the NRL club's lineup for their match against the Canterbury Bulldogs in Wellington this weekend. Toi Moala Lolohea will replace the Australian in the number 6 jersey for the match after playing the first 6 weeks of the competition at centre. And Team Wellington's beaten New Caledonian club AS Lucy in their Oceania Champions League football match 2-1 in Auckland. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, the nautical odyssey of Dave Lawton, who left the UK in 1999 on a 12-metre sailing boat called the Beacon, eventually made it to New Zealand in 2001. We have part 2 of our window on the world of the emerging cultural colossus that is South Korea, and our pundit Eric Crampton has some largely laissez-faire thoughts on sugar and whether we should tax it. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met service weather to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupō. Isolated showers turning to rain for a time overnight with heavy falls. Showers clearing from Auckland tomorrow morning. From Waikato to Whanganui, including Taihape, occasional rain with heavy and possibly thundery falls clearing from the south this evening and overnight. Manawatu, Horowhenua and Kapiti Coast, fine spells, a few showers clearing tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine today, occasional showers tomorrow. Wellington and Wairarapa, showers developing this afternoon, clearing tomorrow morning. Nelson and Buller, a few showers clearing in Nelson this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Westland, mostly fine. Fiordland, showers, some possibly heavy this evening. Marlborough and Canterbury, patchy rain, clearing south of Christchurch this evening and elsewhere overnight. Otago and Southland, a few showers, clearing in Otago and inland Southland this evening and elsewhere tomorrow morning. And the Chatham Islands, occasional showers. It has just gone 6:08.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina.
Thank you, John.
Let's begin with Hekia Parat. We asked her to come on the programme live this evening. She declined our invitation to appear, but she did have a stand-up in Parliament. That's when she talks to all the media at once as she's passing from the House. The government wants mandatory reporting for all school support staff, not just teachers and principals. It comes in the wake of the sentencing of a school caretaker and bus driver James Selwyn Barrett at the High Court in Christchurch for sexually assaulting a dozen schoolgirls. As we discussed with the Ministry before, he moved from school to school, and at one school he left under circumstances which remained secret under the terms of his departure agreement. Barrett was jailed for nearly 20 years for offending spanning 2 years. He pleaded guilty to 21 sex charges relating to 2 girls at 2 Christchurch schools, including some with special needs. So that's girls at 2 Christchurch schools. The Education Minister Hekia Parata told reporters schools should be required by law to report to the Education Council concerns about all school employees.
At the moment the system captures teachers and principals, but clearly in this particular case this person actually had finished in the profession and had been employed in another role. So I've asked the Ministry and the Education Council to investigate extending their powers to all people who work with kids in ECE and in schools.
Why weren't they included right from the beginning, caretakers, bus drivers and things like that?
Because the Education Council is focused on the profession, and because it's schools' decisions who they employ are accountable for their employment decisions.
Yeah, but as the Education Minister, you must be certainly worried about what's happened, and surely you must be wondering why caretakers weren't part of the vetting process.
Of course I'm concerned about it. I think all of us are concerned that this occurred and that the process has now resulted in a sentencing. But what I'm explaining is that these are all employees of school boards. They are not employees of the Ministry of Education or of the Education Council. But what I've asked them to do is to extend their ambit to, or at least to investigate extending their ambit to include these other employees.
So that's not a full-blown inquiry though, is it? That's just
No, it's not.
What's your reasoning for there not being a need for that, do you think?
Because I'm assured from the work that the Ministry has done is that they received no allegations of sexual improprieties in respect of this person. The first time that it occurred was on the 23rd of March 2015. That's when his employer, the bus service provider, advised the Ministry, and that afternoon the process then kicked in.
What's your message to Barrett's victims?
Oh, look, I feel very sad for these children and for their family. Today doesn't undo the harm, but I hope it brings some measure of comfort to them. And I also want to acknowledge how incredibly brave they were in reporting this, because it now removes the possibility that this person could harm other children.
Hekia Parata talking to the media in Parliament. I think shortly before 5 o'clock, sometime after 4 o'clock. The often contentious decision on fluoridating water supplies is to be taken away from local councils. At the moment, local authorities decide whether or not to fluoridate water after taking advice from district health boards, DHBs. About half of the population currently drinks fluoridated water, but the government plans to bring in legislation this year which would transfer the decision to the DHBs in the first place. Health Minister Jonathan Coleman joins us now on the line from Wellington. Welcome, Minister. Nice to have you on the program.
Good evening, John.
Good evening. Why?
Well, basically, I want to see more fluoride in our water supply. Only 54% of the population are drinking fluoridated water. And we've got 40% of 5-year-olds experiencing tooth decay, 60% in Maori and PI children. 35,000 children under the age of 5 last year had a tooth pulled out because of decay. And all the evidence from the WHO shows that this is the single best measure to reverse tooth decay. The CDC in Atlanta rates water fluoridation as one of the 10 greatest public health achievements of the 20th century. So look, the TLAs, so local government, haven't been keen to continue making these decisions. They say they haven't got the expertise to do it, and I sympathise with that. So we looked at a range of options. From the status quo through to handing it to the DHBs, through to legislation making it compulsory. And it seems that it's going to fit best by handing these decision-making rights to the DHBs.
Okay, Minister, because I like the range, so let's discuss that. If the case is as compelling as you have just stated it, why didn't you legislate? Why are you deferring to the DHBs here? Why don't you have the courage of your convictions and say, hey, New Zealand, here's fluoridation?
Because I think we still need to have the local democratic input into the final decision, and after considering all these matters very carefully for a long time, handing it to the DHBs gets the right balance between, the democratic rights of the local population through their elected DHB members, as well as the imperative we have to get more fluoride into the water, and I think we've landed at the right place.
You weren't actually just copping out a little bit, were you?
What do you think?
Well, I don't know.
No, it's not a cop-out, John.
No, but wait a sec. If fluoridation is one of the major breakthroughs, is one of the 20 great breakthroughs, health breakthroughs of the 20th century.
Yeah, one of the top 10.
And you believe that? You believe that there's a compelling case to be made for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then it's a no-brainer to put it in the water, isn't it?
Well, I think so, but the issue is it's been very contentious in many communities, and so our feeling is that it's still important that local communities get a say. And they get to elect their DHB.
But not too much of a say. This is the confusing thing. They had a say previously, didn't they? When local councils were in charge of it.
Yeah, but the local councils didn't have the expertise, and were very reluctant actually to continue having the responsibility. So the issue is, well, we want more fluoride in the water. What's the right balance between achieving that and also respecting the rights of local communities? And
was Whakatane and what happened there, where it went and then it came back, was at that stage you put your head in your hands and thought, right, there's got to be a plan B?
Oh, look, I've been keen to do this since I became Health Minister.
But was Whakatane the straw that broke the camel's back?
Oh, look, there have been a number of cases. South Taranaki, where, it ended up in the High Court. So not just Whakatane, there's been a number of decisions around the country. And look, when you look at that map and you see the very poor coverage nationally, you realise actually if we can make a difference here, we've got to get more fluoride into the water, and this is an great step forward. Welcomed by all the dentists in New Zealand, welcomed by local government. Everyone thinks it's a good idea.
Except for the people who oppose it. And if our email... No, look, I know the point you were making, I'm not being glib in response to you. Yeah. I'm just saying the people who oppose it really, really oppose it.
They really oppose it. Absolutely they do. But if you look at the weight of science, it is heavily in favour of fluoride in the water. It's the right thing to do, and I totally believe it is.
So would your advice be to the DHBs, go for it?
Yes.
Well, that was a clear answer.
There you go.
It's a triumph, Minister. I'm delighted to hear a yes. Just before you go, I know that you don't want to discuss. I know you might relish the prospect of discussing it, but the hospital meals in Dunedin. So Compass had a meeting with the DHB today, clearly because all the meals that are being served aren't as good as the one you were served on that rather magnificent one-off occasion when you were down there. Are you happy with the food being served in Dunedin Hospital?
Yes, I am, but look, if there are individual complaints, they should be taken up with Compass and with the DHB management, but all I can say is there are nutrition standards around the food, and I went down there and I was served a meal that everyone else ate that day. I've also talked to people with contacts inside Dunedin Hospital who say that actually some of those photos of food is the pureed food that, as I said to you the other night, John, is fed to patients with their jaws wired shut. So, I think there probably has been a bit of mischief making in this debate. But look, I acknowledge that not everyone will be raving about the hospital food, but in the end, we've got to produce nutritious food that is attractive to the patients, and there are clear expectations on Compass and the DHB to do that.
Jonathan Coleman, Health Minister, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Jonathan Coleman, Health Minister, live on the phone from Parliament. We're going to stick with water in a way as Ashburton and surrounds comes to grip with the fact that some of its water is so poor, health warnings are periodically issued against it, and some of its water is so good it's worth commercially bottling. Confusion seems to be reigning over the purchase of the right to extract 40 billion litres of pure artesian water in Ashburton itself. In fact, right beside a proposed business park, if my reading of the map is correct. Is it pure? And if so, how, when some water in the region is so manifestly not pure? Now, we haven't so far been able to discuss the consent process with anyone, including the new owners, but Tim Davey is a water scientist who's Environment Canterbury's acting director of science, and he was available to discuss the water itself with us. So, is it worth bottling?
Oh, most certainly. The water that flows through the Canterbury Plains at depth is very pure and well worth bottling.
Okay, because I'm really confused about this. I have an ECAN report by Lisa Scott and Carl Hansen, June 2013, updated June 2015. I'm sure you know it, Tim. I'm sure you know the report. And if we look at the risk map and we look at high risk, actually the biggest area of high risk is Ashburton, and it seems to me pretty much where this consent has been granted.
So that's in the very shallow aquifer. So at shallow depths, just close to the water table, there is a considerable amount of nitrate in the water. Once you go to below 100 metres, I think this consent they're predicting to go to about 150 to 250 metres, then you're in very, very pure water.
So you've gone way beneath the nitrate leaching. So all the stuff that's been put on the land that has now gone through into the groundwater table, that's much more shallow, is it?
That stays at a much shallower level. Yes, that's right.
So the concerns about water quality in the Canterbury region, and you know them, and I have the report in front of me, are they overstated? Is there confusion about it? What's going on here?
There are several issues around water quality in the Canterbury region. With the shallow aquifer that we talked about, which does have elevated nitrate levels, there are wells that use that water. So people, for their own drinking water, it tends to be their own wells that were drilled quite a long time ago, do go into that where there is relatively high nitrate levels. That's a concern. The second is that some of that shallow groundwater pops up again, not in the Ashburton area, but elsewhere around Canterbury into the spring-fed streams. And there you're getting high nitrate levels popping up into our spring-fed streams, which creates its own problems to do with algal growth in the streams and plant growth and things like that. So that's why there's a water quality issue. But if you're using it for drinking water and you're going deep, then there is no concern around the water quality.
If we go back to Lisa Scott and Carl Hansen's report for ECAN, and I quote from the bottom of page 12, the deeper groundwater, which is what you're talking about, generally has lower nitrate concentrations, exactly as you're saying. However, even deeper groundwater seems to be impacted by human activities. Some deeper wells have concentrations above the MAV. Who has made the determination that this water isn't in that category?
It's up to the consent holder once they start extracting that water to do the testing themselves.
So that's not known. So that's not known. That's not specifically known here.
No, you can never tell for a specific well until it's drilled and you're taking the water itself. But the general knowledge is that it should be, and I'd be very surprised, and on the basis of that, I think you'd be pretty safe to put the investment in and start drilling, expecting it to be better water quality. But you will never know specifically. So there is still some risk attached for the investor as to whether they get that water, but all the information would suggest that it will be of very high water quality.
And all the information would suggest that the concerns people have in Ashburton that somehow this water that is of a very high water quality, when ECAN's own work says that water at shallower levels is not, that it is full of nitrates, that there is enough to go around.
Yes, I believe that's true. There's been a lot of work done in the last 5 years around water allocation in the area, and the result of that has been that the area has been declared what we call a red zone, which means no further water allocation unless water is put back in to the groundwater, which is why this consent has that condition on it, that when they take 45, they also have to put back in 60 litres a second, a greater amount, into the aquifer itself.
So they're taking that out of the neighbouring river, which is the Ashburton?
I believe it's coming from the Ashburton, yes. It might be, no, it would be the Ashburton River, yes.
Okay, and so they are taking water out of the aquifer and replenishing it with water that goes in from the river running down from the Southern Alps.
Yes, so that's water that was previously being taken for stock water, which is allowed under the Resource Management Act, and it's being used to replenish the groundwater. So naturally that's what happens anyway. The river loses water to the aquifer, and this is just making sure even more so does, by actually forcing it in, essentially.
Tim Davey, Environment Canterbury Acting Director of Science and a water scientist. 23 minutes past 6, lots of feedback coming in, as is always the case when we cover hospital food. I've worked as a chef for Compass. It's not about quality. They cater to prisons, military bases, shipping companies and places like compounds on Nauru. Not about quality, it's about practices to extort suppliers to them and also their end clients, says Mike. Obviously we're not able to confirm any of that, but that is Mike's opinion as he emailed it in. Does Compass pay rent for the use of the publicly owned Dunedin Hospital kitchen and its associated utilities, asked Terry. Terry, that's a good question, and next time I speak to Compass, I'm going to do better at actually putting these questions aside. It's a good one. We will ask them. Hi, John. A month ago, I visited a mother and her 9-month-old daughter in the children's ward at Dunedin Hospital. The baby's meal was delivered, a bowl of pureed vegetables with a gravy. It looked disgusting, like a bowl of glue paste with soy sauce poured over it. It was a gluey texture and tasted absolutely revolting. Cheers, Mary. Mary's ended that with 3 exclamation marks. Thank you, Mary. Hi, John. As a nurse of 25 years, I've seen a lot of hospital food. Michael Pollan, in his book Omnivore's Dilemma, summarises ideal nutrition as eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I give my patients over-processed food, little of it fresh, none local, and most of it put back on the meal trolley 20 minutes later. How are patients supposed to heal with the food we give them? Says a person whose name we will not pass on, but is writing in from Blenheim. Thank you all for your feedback. A parihaka woman who uses Māori traditions to bury the dead says the law needs to change to allow Māori to deal with death in their own way. Maata Wharehoka is backing a parliamentary inquiry which was launched today into how the deceased of Māori families are handled. What should happen and what should be allowed to happen? Here's Lee Marama McLaughlin from Te Manu Kōrehi.
For most of us, death will mean a trip to the morgue where our bodies will be drained and filled with preservatives before being put in a coffin and returned to our families. For the Māori process Mata Wharehoka runs, families there the whole time.
I manage the tūpāpaku in such a way that involves not only the tinana, but I also work with the wairua of that tūpāpaku as well, which is never ever addressed in Pākehā terms.
She says whānau members help weave a flax mat or whāriki in which the body is wrapped before it's placed on a wooden waka or body transporter that's made at the same time. Over the last 9 years, Mata Wharehoka and her whānau have buried 70 tūpāpaku this way.
It doesn't matter what they've got in the Act today. We know it's insufficient to cover the things that we as Māori need and desire to do. And it should be the right of our people to choose how we manage this. And for far too long, we've been in a Pākehā system that hasn't given us that right.
It's something the Māori Affairs Select Committee will investigate as part of an inquiry launched today. Its chair, Te Haunuku Korako, explains why.
We had many whānau actually who had raised with us concerns on the access and management of tūpāpaku of deceased members. People who had really sort of traumatic experiences with death situations in hospitals, and particularly with sudden infant death syndrome and also stillborns.
The inquiry will consider the power and practices of pathologists, coroners, the police and funeral directors. He says whānau struggle with what can be a long wait for a body to be returned to them.
Particularly where they've died in hospital, the hold-ups there. And then also if there's a situation where a pathologist report is needed, if they're being held there then by police or funeral directors.
The inquiry was spurred by the Green Party. Its MP on the committee, Marama Davidson, says there are also more modern dilemmas that need to be examined.
For example, getting tūpāpaku back from overseas to Aotearoa, and also issues like the tikanga Māori processes How does that sit alongside the agency processes?
The committee is calling for submissions from experts and whānau before the end of June. It's hoped the process will result in tikanga Māori being accommodated in law and ultimately a better cultural experience for whānau when a family member dies. For Checkpoint, Koli Marama McLaughlin, tēnei.
Coming up to 6:28, this story just in from Reuters. A congressional committee in Brazil has voted to recommend the impeachment of its president, Dilma Rousseff, over claims she manipulated government accounts to hide a growing deficit. Impeachment, Yiming Wu reports.
By a vote of 38 to 27, committee members of Brazil's lower house of Congress decides to recommend the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. She faces charges of breaking budget laws to support her re-election in 2014.
Brazil is in a grave economic situation. The country is stalled. The president of the republic's seat is empty. For this reason, the Social Democracy Party votes yes to impeachment.
Rousseff has denied any wrongdoing, but the political storm, fueled by Brazil's worst recession in decades, has made her lose allies in Congress. Political watchers say this committee vote could have a snowball effect. A vote in the full lower house will take place on Sunday, and if 2/3 vote in favour, the case will be sent to the Senate. Rousseff will be suspended immediately for up to 6 months if the upper house majority decides to put her on trial. She would be the first Brazilian president to be impeached since 1992 and won't be able to run for elected office for 8 years.
That report just in from Reuters. Brazil very much under the spotlight, of course. Well, more than usual. It's a large country, but with the Olympics coming up, the world's media are turning their attention to it. Fascinating case that the Brazil Congressional Committee has recommended impeachment of its president for trying to conceal budget overblows. Just before we go tonight, someone texted in before the news and said, why does Minister Coleman support water fluoridation but not a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages? I made a mental note to ask him that. Lots of people said, John, you forgot. And like a doofus, I did. So we will get back to him and ask him that question and report back with the answer tomorrow night. Thank you all for being with us. That ends Checkpoint for this Tuesday evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The government wants mandatory reporting for all school support staff in the wake of the sentencing of a school caretaker and bus driver for serial sex offending against girls. The government says it will be up to individual DHBs how they introduce fluoride into the water supply when it takes responsibility from councils. The Prime Minister has a short-term deposit with a firm specialising in foreign trusts. And housing prices and sales are pushing higher. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Welcome to World Watch PM. I'm John Greaves. Tonight, hopes a truce in Yemen will hold ahead of peace talks. In a historic move, East Timor takes Australia to the United Nations. And another musician